purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
Hello, my name is Hugh Henry. This is Freethought Forum. I'm here with Ron Palermo, and we're here to talk about Cuba, the other side. Ron Palermo is a local teacher and a member of the Pastors for Peace, an organization that supports normalized relations with Cuba. This group has organized caravans that have traveled throughout the U.S., bringing much-needed school buses, school supplies, and medical equipment to Cuba. So, Ron, tell us about Pastors for Peace and their involvement with Cuba.
Well, Pastors for Peace has been around for about 20 or 30 years now, and pastors is actually a misnomer. We're not ministers. Some of us aren't even religious, but that's the name we decided because we try to pastor to people in need. Mm-hmm. And we're part of the IFCO, it's the Interfaith Community Organization. And the purpose of the organization is to be involved in social justice issues in Latin America. And Cuba happens to be a great interest of ours because of the present embargo that has been going on for a long time now.
Well, give us a brief description of U.S.-Cuba historical relations and the reasons for the embargo.
Started well over 100 years ago.
Wow.
Yes. Well, in 1898, the U.S. wanted Cuba because Cuba's only 90 miles from Florida. And so the rumor was they manufactured an incident, but that, of course, is a rumor, which led to the Spanish-American War.
As a military buff, I can get into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The battleship Maine blew up in harbor, and Cuba's a very hot place, and the stuff they propelled the shells with was very touchy stuff and prone to explode on its own without anybody bothering it at all. Mm. The gleatonite they used, they had that problem for years. The most likely reason for the Maine to blow up was that the gleatonite kicked over the edge and blew. Mm-hmm. But go ahead.
Which was convenient for the U.S., but either way,
well,
however
it was
it
convenient
started,
for the Hearst papers. I know the president didn't want any part of it, and he got dragged kicking and screaming into it by the Hearst papers.
Mm. And throughout the years, the U.S. has had one puppet or another in there controlling the island. They call themselves independent, but of course they responded to U.S. demands throughout the years. Well, in 54, Fidel Castro decided to launch an attack, and it was really a pitiful attempt. But they attacked one of the barracks and were killed and arrested, and he was sent to jail. Well, there was a general amnesty, so he was let out a couple of years later. And then he went to Mexico and organized some troops and went back to Cuba for the invasion. And his brother, Raul, controlled one part of the country and he controlled the other. And it was really a peasant revolt. You know, they got the country people to fight, and Che Guevara was in there. And for some reason, they say it was real strange, but Batista thought he was defeated, and he left the country, even though they said he had some fight in him. So Castro took over in '59. He's outlasted 10 U.S. presidents so far.
I remember at the time that initially America was friendly to, while Castro was still in the hills, I remember seeing news mm-hmm. reports on TV that we were kind of friendly to his cause. Mm-hmm. And then he started making nice with the Russians, and suddenly he was not our friend anymore.
Well, Castro did get some positive press in the New York Times, and the U.S. was kind of wary, kind of feeling him out. But he had looked at history and some of the U.S. actions in prior years, like throwing over our Benz in Guatemala, who was democratically elected. And so he was real concerned. So at that point, I think he decided to jump ship and to become a communist and to align himself with Russia. There was no evidence that he was a communist prior to that.
Yeah, at least none that anybody knew about. Mm-hmm. Although he did have Che Guevara on board. at that time.
And then, of course, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a pretty tense situation.
Yeah. Well, in between you have the Bay of Pigs, with the attempted invasion of Cuba set up by Eisenhower, but it couldn't be executed before Kennedy came into office.
Yeah, and those incidents have flared up, but basically it's been kind of just a hate-hate relationship. Neither side has really trusted the other to open up and to do anything.
Well, then there are the Miami Cubans. You might talk about that bunch.
Some would argue that's the reason for our unreasonable policy toward Cuba, and I'll get into some of the details about that. But the Miami Cubans are powerful economically. There's hundreds of thousands of them.
Well, who were these guys and where did they come from?
Well, the reason there are so many is kind of interesting. The U.S. has a unique policy with Cuba. If any Cuban is allowed to touch U.S. soil, they're giving automatic rights to stay here. And I met a Puerto Rican gentleman the other day, and he said the same thing, if they touch Puerto Rican soil. And Puerto Rico, of course, is a U.S. Commonwealth, so that would make sense.
That comes later. I'm talking about who were the initial Miami Cubans who managed to get all these policies in place.
Well, these were the people that were in power when Castro took control. Cuba was a third world country. It is now, but back then they had an incredible division of wealth. The wealth was controlled by very few people, and the poor were, for the most part, illiterate and didn't receive any kind of medical care. So you had a society with extremes.
I understand some of the owners and so forth were the mob. Meyer Lansky, outside the United States, ended his life in Cuba quite happily. And the mob was heavily involved in gambling and in owning Cuba. And Castro pulled the switch on that.
Yes, I had heard many stories that Cuba was the place to go in the Caribbean, the fun place, because you could get anything you wanted. And of course, the Cubans weren't allowed in the casinos. Not that the majority could have afforded to enter to begin with, but that was a problem, that it was controlled.
There's also Kennedy assassination connections with Cuba. I think, what's his name, the guy who was accused?
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey Oswald had been through there. And there's one of the speculated reasons for the death of Kennedy has to do with Kennedy asking the mob to off Castro, and then his brother turning around and hammering the mob in federal court. And they thought that was terribly insulting and shot him. That's one of the leading theories.
Yeah, lots of conspiracy theories. They do know for a fact, though, that the CIA has tried to assassinate Castro on numerous occasions. I mean, the humorous from putting an explosive device in a cigar to sending, hitmen to attack the island.
And something to make him crazy at one point, I think. Yeah, that came up in the post-Watergate hearings on assassination, didn't it? Where the United States at that time decided it didn't want to be in the assassination business. Well, let's talk about the embargo, since that's what you wanted to talk about. Sure. So we never got to the reasons for the embargo. I'd say the Miami Cubans were enough, but go ahead.
Well, it's interesting that there really aren't logical reasons for the embargo, so you have to look for illogical ones. Cuba was aligned with the Soviet Union, which would make them our enemy by proxy, but then again the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba no longer receives that support. So that really doesn't make sense. The United States doesn't like being laughed at, and Castro is
very good at it.
Very good, and he's very boisterous and a fiery speaker, and he speaks for hours and hours, and of course he has a captive audience there. So,
well, also there was Cuban involvement in communist movements throughout Central and Latin America. Che Guevara was a prime example of, although he's an Argentine, was supported out of Cuba, and they were involved. And anybody who's a leftist, Castro was a friend of. There's currently a problem with Chavez in Venezuela making nice with Castro in Cuba.
Yeah, Castro, I believe, would like to see the revolution spread, but I don't believe he controls other people. He wants them to determine their own future in these oppressed countries.
Okay, what have been the costs of the embargo?
The costs have been tremendous. Cuba's a tremendous market, and it's interesting the group put together that is fighting the embargo. You have conservative Republicans who believe that interaction with the United States, the interchange of ideas and materials, will cause a freer Cuba. You have businessmen that are just salivating because they have all these products, to sell. Even the Texas legislature, which is not known for liberalism, in June of 2001 passed a resolution opening trade with Cuba. It was non-binding,
Wow.
of course. And so you've got quite a coalition of people who are interested in ending the embargo.
Maybe if Castro sends Tom DeLay a box of cigars, you can tip it over. Well, you mentioned the people who were supporting lifting the embargo.
Mm-hmm.
How does the rest of the world? Now, I know this goes back, the rest of the world isn't on real good terms with George Bush, but this rest of the world view goes back decades before George Bush.
Yes. Virtually every year in the United Nations, they have a vote on the Cuban embargo. And the vote fluctuates quite a bit. It's either 171 to 2 or 169 to 4, somewhere between those. And the two are always the United States and, of course, our ally Israel.
Uh-huh.
And the ones who fluctuate are the Marshall Islands. There was the president of a breakaway Russian republic. They asked him why he voted, and he said, I was drunk that day, and he didn't realize which side he was voting for. So it's usually about 99% of the world's nations vote against the embargo. They think it's absolutely absurd.
How did Americans feel about?
Americans are somewhat apathetic. I think the average American is just unaware of what's going on in Cuba. It's a small island, and of course the last few years it hasn't gotten a lot of press other than Guantanamo Bay.
Well, it's not that small an island. It's a fairly good chunk of real estate.
Yeah, and there's about 10 million people there, but it just hasn't seemed to hit the radar.
I guess it's a small island in Shangri-La for us, something like that.
And since we don't have contact and we're not legally allowed to travel, most Americans are somewhat ignorant of what actually goes on there.
How do Cubans feel about the embargo?
Cubans are somewhat perplexed. I've spoken with people who have traveled there, and the Cubans seem to say, why doesn't why don't Americans tell their government that this embargo doesn't make sense? Why don't they want to have relations with us? So they kind of question the purpose behind it.
Oh, that's easy. The electoral vote's in Florida.
Yes, yes, and I think they're well aware of that.
Which brings us to the Cuban Americans. I assume you have two halves of the Cuban American community.
Yes, you have well, they call them the Miami Cubans, a very conservative bloc. As we referred to earlier, they were the power elite when Castro took over, or the relatives of them. And they're strident anti-Castro. As a matter of fact, I remember an issue with this Elian Gonzalez.
The kid.
Yeah, tell a little summary of the story. His mother tried to enter the United States with him, and she ended up dying in the attempt, and he was rescued at sea. Well, the Miami Cubans wanted him to become a U.S. citizen because they said his mother's intent was to bring him here, even though his father was in Cuba and wanted him returned, and clearly a parent has the say. So it was a huge national issue, and Al Gore was so fearful of losing the Cuban vote that he voted in favor of the Miami Cubans and against our own courts, which ruled at every step of the way that you must return this boy to his father.
Yeah, but the guy who counted, President Clinton, authorized his return.
Yes.
Which might not have helped Al very much.
Sure, but Clinton had no choice. He had to, fulfill the verdicts of the court. So,
are there other Cuban Americans that are on the other side of this?
There are quite a few Cubans who are sympathetic with Castro. I haven't seen the latest. It used to be about 50-50, but I would guess there are a few more conservatives now. That seems to be the impetus of the output that I've seen.
I understand Castro put some pressure on this whole population by changing the way money was transferred to Cuba. Do you want to go into that?
This is a strange situation regarding money. Now, in '86, I don't think we should spend some time on this. A law was passed called Helms-Burton, and it was Senator Jesse Helms, extremely conservative senator from North Carolina, and a congressman from California named Dan Burton. And the joke was that he had these strict laws passed because he didn't want North Carolina tobacco farmers competing with Cuban cigars. So, but the truth is that they passed these stringent laws restricting the amount of money that could be sent to Cuba and restricting the amount of money that a visitor could spend there, restricting travel. And what really upset the world community is that they put restrictions on what citizens of other nations could do. Part of the law was that if a shipping company from Europe were to send a shipload of products to Cuba, they were not allowed to enter the U.S. port for 6 months. Now, any size company would have problems dealing only with the Cuban market, so it pretty much quenched their desire to do business with Cuba. And then they even said if any foreign businessman entered Cuba, they weren't allowed to enter the United States. And so they created
This sounds something like the stuff that happens on the Arab-Israeli border, where if you're going to go to Jordan and Israel, you got to go through Jordan first, because if you went through, if you went through Jordan and Israel, you had to go through Israel first, because if you went to Jordan first, the Israelis wouldn't let you in with your passport stamped. Either that or you wind up getting an extra passport or some other nonsense. But we were continuing with this embargo and some monetary restrictions that came recently.
Okay, the most recent ones were, it used to be you could spend, I believe it's $164 a day. And just a few months ago, Bush tightened that, where he now only permits you to spend $50 a day. And so they're making it even more difficult.
Plus there was a restriction on sending a total sum for 1 year or something.
Well, it used to be that you were permitted to send $1,200 per year, and he wanted to lessen that, but there was such an outcry that they kept that restriction. The other major change was Cuban Americans were allowed to visit their family once a year, and he changed that to once every 3 years. But the interesting part of this story is the enforcement. He dedicated 24 Treasury agents to enforcing the travel restriction to Cuba. And there's only 4 agents dedicated to illegal travel to terrorist countries.
Oh, well, that's different.
Yes. And this undue emphasis just amazes me.
Not if you want Florida. Is anyone, except for the Florida electoral votes, is anyone profiting from the embargo? Well,
the people who have the markets here, perhaps the big crops in Cuba are tobacco and sugar, may not want extra competition. This, as any unreasonable laws do, this has brought some illegal activity. What's going on is a lot of Miami people with relatives in Cuba are finding ways to go to Cuba to bring much needed things, like they're going through Mexico or Canada.
Yeah, I think it's surprising how many senators you will find with embargoed Cuban cigars to offer, or how many of their supporters will offer senators embargoed Cuban cigars.
There's a story of the ex-Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, was smoking a Cuban cigar. And someone asked him, well, what are you doing? He says, I'm burning down the country, one leaf at a time.
All right, here's something I think we can discuss a lot. What does the future hold for American-Cuban relations?
I
guess the big question is post-Castro.
Yes, the $64,000 question. Well, when Castro dies, he claims the revolution will continue. The revolution is of the people. The experts say that his brother, Raul, who's in better shape and a few years younger, although by no means a healthy young man, will take over. The Miami Cubans have actually divided the island up. And believe it or not, they sell lots based on like futures, like commodity futures.
Of property they don't own.
Property that they don't own. They've already divided and they have this whole market system set up. So they're ready to swim over as soon as Fidel bites the dust.
It sounds like you're talking about what happened at the end of the Soviet Union with the gerontocracy, where Raul takes over, lives a couple of years, and then some other old guard guy takes over and lives a couple of years. If both America and Cuba are lucky, the death of Castro will be treated like the death of Yasser Arafat, an opportunity to normalize relations, if we're lucky. Although I'm sure the Miami Cubans would object very strongly to Raul Castro being in charge.
Oh yes, yeah, they're going to try to get in there one way or another, whatever it takes. They feel it's their property, and they.
Well, I've told you, and I may get in trouble for this. If I were the Cuban government and relationship did normalize with the United States, I would ensure that no Miami Cuban from Cuba ever got a passport, ever got a visa to come into the country, because those guys think they're the crown princes and dukes and barons, and they're going to come back and establish their royalty.
Oh, sure.
And I wouldn't want them, and I wouldn't trust them. Anybody else but them. They've been a very nasty bunch. But do you have any ideas about what will happen?
You never really know. I suspect that the U.S. government will somehow buy people off. It's been such a political.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure to normalize relations, and it might overcome. When it can't overcome Castro, it might overcome Raul Castro's the objection to him, and say, no, we're going.
Yes, yeah. You never know what'll happen, but I just can't imagine a future in Cuba without United States influence. Castro seems to be the personality that holds the revolution together, and without him, who knows?
Now, I know one of the things that, because of the embargo, there are lots of industries they can't do in Cuba. One of the industries they did do, because you can do it with almost nothing in terms of imported material, is they are major world developers of vaccines. And their vaccines are used all over the world, and they're quite sophisticated, and their vaccines are quite trusted. It would be ironic if Cuban vaccines saved us from the worldwide epidemic of the bird flu, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Yes, that's an amazing success story. So you never hear the good things that come out of Cuba. And they have national health care, which we don't have. We're supposedly the #1 economy in the world. I question that with all our debt. And they have an infant mortality rate lower than the United States. There's a lot of emphasis on preventative health care because they just aren't able to take care of major illnesses, so they're very health conscious. They also have an excellent educational system, even though they don't have the money to invest in technology, but they do quite well. They claim a Cuban junior high school graduate does better than a U.S. high school graduate. Those are just anecdotes. I don't know if that's accurate or not. There's an argument that they're brainwashed, but isn't every student brainwashed about how great their country is? You hear stories about George Washington, and you never hear the other side. So
I know one thing that's not embargoed is baseball players.
No. As a matter of fact, they said that, I don't know if I can remember this, but the U.S. had a policy on letting people stay here, letting Cubans stay here. It's ABC. athletes, and I can't, ballerinas, I think, and I can't remember what the C is. There's like those people get special status. Anything that would somehow weaken Cuba, the United States supports. And Cuba has always competed very well. Of course, in baseball, they've been world champions throughout history. And in the Olympics, they do extremely well for a country that's small. They've always had many champion boxers.
Yeah, them too. One of the keys to the Cuban Missile Crisis was when bases that were supposed to be Cuban started putting in soccer fields instead of baseball diamonds. They knew, oops, nope, not Cubans.
Uh-huh.
That was one of the aerial photography indicators that they had a not Cuban bases. If there wasn't a baseball diamond, those guys were not Cubans. Let me think. There was oh yes, they have, because their economy has had to stay at a very low key, they have some of the best preserved nature areas in the Caribbean on their island. I mean, you haven't got real estate developers and you haven't got development, so they didn't get developed.
Yes, that's the beauty of Cuba. From people I've spoken with who have traveled there, they said that it's so unlike the United States where you see billboards everywhere or a factory or
I can't afford it.
That's, yeah. But also I think it's an intentional effort. I think they want to keep the island beautiful, and they're tourism is one of their big businesses. And 2 million people a year travel to Cuba to enjoy the great beaches and the nature. And 200,000 Americans went there, some of them with permits through the government. Most, I suspect, without.
Yeah, I suppose it's a very nice place for a congressional junket. I've gotten to the end of some of the questions. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what it's like on the other side of the "we're not here" line between the United States and Cuba?
Well, I believe part of the problem is we don't get an accurate message of what's going on in Cuba. And it is a very poor country, and they have a lot of faults. But most of their problems, I believe, come from the United States.
I get this impression that somewhere up at the top end there's an aging Castro with a lot of fantasy. And then underneath him, they've simply quietly put the thing together and made it work, not according to the fantasy. They just made the damn thing work.
Yeah, it's you would think, well, the average person would think, Cuba's poor, these people have nothing to live for, they're miserable, they want to get rid of Castro, they want to become capitalists. And the truth of the matter is, the Cubans I've met are extremely happy people. Not all of them support the government, but they're not going to let politics get in the way of their happiness. And they have very low salaries, but they are given a house, they're given food, education and health care are taken care of, and most of them have something going on the side too, either cutting hair or selling some knickknacks, some artwork or something like that. So they're kind of mini capitalists in themselves.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. This is Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum, hoping you'll tune in again for our next show. Thank you very much.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no